The carriage had stopped breathing. That was the only way Cora could describe the sound that came from inside it. Not a scream. Not yet. But the low, suffocated gasp of someone realizing the air around her had turned against her. She stood at the edge of the muddy crossroads outside the tavern, a tray of empty mugs still balanced against her hip, and watched the black carriage tilt sideways into the flooded ditch like a wounded animal that had given up trying to rise. No one moved. That was the part that would stay with her longest. Not the rain, not the panic of the horses screaming as they thrashed against their harnesses, not even the way the carriage door had jammed itself shut against the swollen wood frame. It was the stillness of the men standing 20 feet away, soldiers in the gray and silver livery of the Alpha King's own guard, watching the carriage fill with ditch water, as if they were watching a play they had already decided not to clap for. "She's only the king's mother," one of them muttered to another, low enough that he probably thought the rain would swallow it. "Let the new wife handle it. Not our place." Cora had heard a lot of cruel things said by men who thought no one of consequence was listening. She had poured ale over enough of them to know the shape cruelty took when it believed itself safe. But this was a woman drowning by inches, while 6 armed men decided whose problem she was. She set the tray down on the porch rail without thinking about it. The window of the carriage was crusted with old grime and new rain, but through it she could see a shape pressed to the glass, an arm in fine gray wool beating weakly against wood that wouldn't give. The water inside had to be at her knees already, climbing. "Someone open it," Cora said. Her voice didn't carry the way she wanted it to. Nobody so much as turned their head. She didn't remember crossing the distance. She remembered the cold first. Mud sucking at her boots, water soaking through wool to skin, and then her hands closing around the iron carriage lantern bolted loose at the front corner, wrenching it free with a strength she didn't know her arms had, until the metal tore from its socket and left her palm bleeding. "Move," she said to no one, because no one was trying to stop her, only watching, the way people watch weather. The first strike against the window did nothing but wring her wrist with pain. The second cracked it. By the third, water and glass came outward together, and Cora shoved her arm in past the shards without flinching, found wet fabric, found a thin, cold hand, and pulled. The woman who came through that window was not young. Silver threaded thick through dark hair plastered to a face lined with the kind of grief that doesn't fade so much as settle. Her lips had gone the color of bruised plums. But her eyes, when they opened, when they found Cora's face inches from her own, were sharp enough to cut through the rain entirely. "You," the woman rasped, water spilling from her mouth. "You came." "Of course I came," Cora said, because there was no other answer that made sense to her, and dragged her the rest of the way out onto the muddy bank, both of them collapsing together in the wet grass while the soldiers finally began shouting orders at each other as though the crisis had only just occurred to them. It was in that moment, kneeling in the mud with a half-drowned woman gripping her wrist like a lifeline, that Cora heard the second carriage arrive. She didn't need anyone to tell her who it was. The crowd told her, the way the soldiers straightened as if struck, the way even the rain seemed to quiet its complaint against the world. A black horse the size of a small storm cut through the haze, and the man who dismounted from it before it had fully stopped moving did not walk so much as arrive, the way weather arrives, sudden and absolute. He was tall in the way that made doorways seem smaller, broad through the shoulders beneath a fur-lined cloak gone dark with rain. Dark hair pulled back in tight braids that did nothing to soften the hard architecture of his face. A thin scar crossed one cheekbone, pale against sun-darkened skin. His eyes found his mother on the ground before they found anything else, and something in his expression cracked open for exactly 1 second, raw, unguarded, terrified, before it slammed shut again into something far more dangerous. Who let this happen? His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Quiet enough that every soldier present went rigid, as though volume would have been a mercy. No one answered. No one dared to. Cora, still kneeling in the mud with the king's mother's hand locked around her wrist, realized distantly that she was the only person in the clearing not afraid of him. She was too soaked, too cold, too furious at the men who had stood and watched a woman drown to have room left for fear of one more man in fine clothes. She was conscious the whole time, Cora said, before she could think better of it. They were going to wait for someone with more authority to decide whether saving her was worth the trouble. The king's gaze swung to her like a blade changing direction. For a moment he only looked at her, at the blood running thin and pink down her wrist where the broken glass had caught her, at the tavern apron soaked through and clinging to her frame, at the fact that she had not let go of his mother's hand even now. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, not quite. More like he was trying to place her in a world that made sense to him and failing. "Cora," she said, "I work at the Hollow Stag." She tipped her head toward the tavern behind her, as though that explained anything at all, as though a serving girl pulling a queen mother out of a flooded ditch with her bare hands was an ordinary Tuesday. The woman in her arms made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her cold fingers tighter around Cora's wrist. "Evander," she said to her son, voice cracking on the single syllable. She broke the window with her hands. Your guard stood there and watched. Something shifted behind the king's eyes. Cora watched it happen the way she might watch a storm front roll in over the hills. Slow, then total. He turned, and the soldiers who had stood frozen moments before now seemed to want very badly to disappear into the wet ground. "Get the physician," he said, still quiet. Quieter than before, if anything. Now. 2 men broke into a run as though released from something. The king knelt then, knelt in the mud, in front of his own mother and a tavern girl, neither of them, dropping to one knee with no care at all for the fine cloak now ruined beneath him, and gathered the older woman gently from Cora's arms. "I'm here," he murmured to her, and his voice had changed entirely, gone low and unguarded in a way Cora suspected very few people ever heard. "I'm here, Mother. I'm here." It was only after the physician's carriage had thundered up the road, after the Queen Mother had been wrapped in dry furs and lifted with infinite care onto a litter, after the soldiers had finally been sent away with words Cora didn't catch, but that made 2 of them go pale. It was only then that the king turned back to her. She was still kneeling in the mud. She hadn't moved. It hadn't occurred to her to move. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and crouched in front of her, taking her bleeding hand in both of his, with a care that startled her more than his earlier fury had. His hands were warm, impossibly warm, given the rain. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. The cut ran deep along the heel of her palm, and now that the adrenaline was fading, it had begun to throb in time with her pulse. "It is not nothing." He said it the way he'd said who let this happen. Quiet, absolute. A correction that left no room for argument. He turned her hand over gently in the gray light, studying the wound with an intensity that made her want to pull away and didn't, somehow, quite manage to. "You did what 6 trained men would not do." "They were afraid of choosing wrong," Cora said. "I didn't have anything to lose by choosing." His eyes lifted to hers at that, and for the first time she saw something there that unsettled her far more than his authority had. A kind of recognition, sudden and unwilling, like a man hearing a name he hadn't known he was waiting for. "What is your name again?" he said, though she knew he had not forgotten it. "Cora. Cora," he repeated, as though testing the weight of it. Then abruptly, as if catching himself doing something he hadn't given himself permission to do, he stood, drawing her up with him by the hand he still held. "You will come to the castle. My mother will want to thank you properly, and that wound needs tending before it festers." "I have a shift," Cora said, some absurd reflex of ordinary life rising up against the impossibility of the moment. At the tavern. I can't just... You can. Not unkind, simply final, the way a king's words tended to be. I will speak to whoever requires speaking to. She should have argued further. She would think later that she should have argued further. But there was something in the steadiness of his grip, in the low, banked fire still visible behind his eyes from whatever fear he had just survived, that made refusal feel like the wrong shape of word entirely. All right, she said. He didn't smile. But something in his jaw loosened, fractionally, as though he'd braced for a fight he was relieved not to have. Behind them, the broken carriage still sat half-submerged in the ditch, glass scattered like ice across the muddy bank, and the rain went on falling over a crossroads that had, in the space of 20 minutes, quietly rearranged the rest of Cora's life, without asking her permission at all. The castle swallowed her whole. Cora had grown up half a day's walk from its outer walls, and had never once imagined standing inside them. Not as a serving girl carrying ale to soldiers passing through, not as anyone. Now she stood in a corridor lined with tapestries faded soft by centuries of candlelight, her boots leaving wet prints on stone. Someone would have to mop later, and tried not to flinch every time a servant glanced at her ruined apron. This way, said the woman who'd been sent to fetch her. Not unkind, but brisk, the kind of brisk that came from genuine busyness rather than disdain. The physician's nearly done with your hand, and then her grace wishes to see you. Her grace is awake? Cora asked, surprised. She'd expected exhaustion, fever, perhaps days of recovery before the Queen Mother could manage visitors. Her grace, the woman said, allowing herself the ghost of a smile, has been asking for you since she opened her eyes. Wouldn't let the physician near her until she knew you'd been seen to as well. The physician turned out to be an older man with ink-stained fingers and the gentlest hands Cora had ever felt on an open wound. He cleaned the gash along her palm with something that stung sharply and smelled of crushed herbs, then stitched it closed with quick, sure movements while she stared fixedly at the window to keep from watching the needle. You'll keep the use of your hand, he said when he'd finished, wrapping clean linen around it. Though I'd advise against punching out any more carriage windows for at least a fortnight. I'll try to restrain myself. He laughed, surprised, like he hadn't expected wit from her, and that was the first moment since the crossroads that Cora felt something in her chest loosen. The Queen Mother's chambers smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, a fire built high against the chill that still clung to her bones. She sat upright against a mountain of pillows. Color returned to her face. Dark hair now dry and loose around shoulders wrapped in a heavy shawl. When Cora entered, she set down the cup of broth in her hands with a clatter that suggested she'd forgotten she was holding it. There she is. Her voice was stronger now, warmer, though still threaded with the rasp of swallowed ditch water. Come here, girl. Let me look at you properly. Cora approached, suddenly unsure what the protocol was for standing in front of a king's mother. She settled for an awkward half-bow that made the older woman wave a hand dismissively. None of that. Not from you. Sit. She gestured to the chair beside the bed, and when Cora hesitated, added, I outlived a husband, 2 wars, and a flooded ditch this morning. I have very little patience left for formality. Sit. Cora sat. My name is Wynne, the Queen Mother said, and I have spent the last hour being told by every soldier who returned from that crossroads exactly why none of them acted, and not one explanation has satisfied me. Her mouth thinned. They will be dealt with. That is not your concern. What is my concern is that a girl with no obligation to me at all tore a lantern off a carriage wall with her bare hands rather than watch me drown for the sake of propriety. I wasn't thinking about propriety, Cora admitted. No, I imagine you weren't thinking about much beyond the fact that someone needed pulling out of the water. Wynne studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to peel back several layers at once. What's your story, Cora? A girl who serves ale at the Hollow Stag doesn't move the way you moved, doesn't speak the way you speak either, when you forget to be careful. Cora felt something in her chest tighten. It wasn't the first time someone had remarked on it, the way her vowels sometimes slipped into shapes too refined for a tavern girl, the way she sometimes caught herself standing straighter than the work required. She'd spent 6 years training herself out of those habits, mostly successfully. My mother kept house for a merchant family before she died, Cora said, which was true, if not the whole truth. I picked up things. It doesn't mean anything. Wynn's eyes lingered on her face a beat too long, as though she'd heard the door close on something and chosen, for now, not to push it open. Was all she said. Then, briskly, well, whatever you were before, you are now the woman who saved my life, and I intend to make that inconvenient for you in the best possible way. You will stay here as my guest until that hand heals properly. I won't hear arguments. Your Grace, I have work. Your work, Wynn said, has been compensated for the next month, and your employer informed that you are performing a service to the crown that takes precedence. I am told he wept with gratitude rather than argue the point, which tells me he is either a very loyal man or very afraid of my son. Possibly both. Cora pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Possibly both, she agreed. It was 3 days later, in the castle's east garden, that she saw the king again. She hadn't expected to. In the days since the crossroads, she'd glimpsed him only at a distance, crossing courtyards with advisors trailing him like anxious geese, standing at the head of long tables in rooms she wasn't permitted near, his voice occasionally carrying down corridors in tones too low for her to make out words, only wait. He had the look of a man perpetually mid-decision, the kind of exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from the constant pressure of being the only person in a room whose mistakes had consequences for everyone else in it. She found him at the edge of the garden's reflecting pool, alone, no advisors, no guards within easy sight, simply standing with his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on water gone still and dark with evening. I didn't think kings were allowed to be alone, she said, before she could stop herself. He turned. Something in his face eased slightly at the sight of her. Not a smile. He didn't seem a man who smiled easily, but a softening around the eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Kings aren't, he agreed. I find moments anyway. It's a small rebellion. Should I leave you to it? No. The word came faster than she suspected he'd intended, and a flicker of something almost embarrassed crossed his face before he smoothed it away. Stay, if you'd like. She came to stand beside him at the pool's edge, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, even in the cooling evening air. A strange thing, she thought, for a man who'd been knelt in freezing mud 3 days prior without complaint. How is your hand? He asked. Healing. The physician says I'll barely scar. Good. A pause. I haven't properly thanked you. Your mother has thanked me approximately 40 times since I arrived. I think the debt's been settled several times over. My mother's thanks and mine are not the same currency. He said it simply, without flourish, and something about the directness of it made her chest go strange and tight. I keep thinking about how long it took me to reach that crossroads. If you hadn't... I did, Cora said, cutting off the thought before he could finish it, because she could see what it would cost him to say it aloud. She's safe. That's the only part that matters now. He looked at her then with an intensity that made her want to look away, and didn't, quite. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Refusing to let anyone, myself included, sit too long in fear or guilt. You did it at the crossroads, too. You simply decided what needed doing and did it, and left no room for anyone to spiral around the decision. Someone has to, she said, or nothing gets done. I've found that out the hard way, mostly. Something flickered behind his eyes. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, the look of a man cataloging a detail he intended to return to later. "The hard way," he repeated. "There's a story in that. There's a story in most things, if you dig long enough." She kept her voice light, deliberately so, and watched him decide not to push, though it clearly cost him something to let it go. "Evander," he said instead, holding out a hand, not the kind of gesture a king made to a tavern girl, and they both seemed to know it, the strange formality of an introduction 3 days too late. "I should have given you my name properly before now." "I know who you are," Cora said, though she took his offered hand anyway, his fingers closing warm and careful around hers, mindful of the healing wound across her palm. "Knowing a title isn't the same as knowing a name," he said. "I'd like you to know mine." The space between them had narrowed without either of them quite choosing it, close enough now that she could see the scar across his cheekbone in detail, the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes that even his bearing couldn't fully disguise. He didn't let go of her hand. She didn't pull it away. "Evander," she said, testing the shape of it the way he'd tested hers at the crossroads. Something in his expression shifted. Pleased, almost boyish for half a heartbeat. An expression so at odds with the controlled authority she'd seen him wear that it startled a small laugh out of her. "What?" he said, though he was nearly smiling now himself. "Nothing. You look different when you're not being a king." "I'm rarely permitted not to be," he said, and the smile faded into something more contemplative. "It's restful, whatever this is." Neither of them named what this was. Neither of them, she suspected, was entirely sure yet. But when a guard's footsteps finally sounded on the garden path, announcing some new urgent matter requiring the king's attention, Evander released her hand slowly, reluctantly, and the absence of his warmth lingered against her skin long after he'd gone. She stood alone at the reflecting pool a while longer, watching the water settle back into stillness, and tried to ignore the small, traitorous warmth unfurling in her chest, because warmth like that, in her experience, was usually the first thing the world took from you once it noticed you'd let yourself feel it. The summons came on the 5th morning, delivered by a steward whose face had gone carefully blank in the way of servants trained never to react to anything. "Her Grace requests your presence in the council annex," he said. "Immediately if you're able." Cora was able. She'd spent the morning in the small guest chamber she'd been given, restless in a way she didn't have words for yet, turning the wrapped bandage on her palm over and over, as though the motion might settle something in her chest that the garden conversation 2 nights prior had unsettled. She followed the steward through corridors she was beginning, despite herself, to learn the shape of. The council annex was smaller than she'd expected. A round room with a single long table, maps pinned to one wall, and Wynne already seated at its head, her face arranged into an expression Cora hadn't seen on her yet. Not warmth. Calculation. "Close the door," Wynne said to the steward, and waited until it clicked shut, before gesturing Cora into the chair across from her. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because I think you've been giving me careful half-truths since the day I met you, and I'd like to stop pretending I haven't noticed." Cora's stomach dropped, though she kept her face still. "Your Grace." "Wynne. And don't Your Grace me into a corner. I've had 3 days to think about a girl who serves ale with the bearing of a woman raised in a manor house, who speaks like someone who once had a tutor correct her grammar, and who flinched. Just slightly, just once, when one of my guards mentioned the name Hawthorne Hall in passing yesterday." Wynne leaned forward. "Hawthorne Hall burned 11 years ago. The fire that killed Lord Aldrich Hawthorne and his wife. I remember it because my husband sent men to help fight it. Though they arrived too late to save anyone but a single household guard, who later swore the family's young daughter had died in the blaze alongside her parents." The room had gone very quiet. Cora could hear her own pulse in her ears. "She didn't die," Wynne said, gently now, watching Cora's face the way a physician watches for the moment a fever breaks. Did she? Cora sat very still for a long moment, the careful architecture of 6 years collapsing quietly in her chest. No, she said finally, the word coming out smaller than she meant it to. She didn't. Tell me. So Cora told her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam giving way after years of careful patching. She told Wynne about the night the fire started. Not an accident. She'd always known that, though she'd been only 15 and had no proof. Only the memory of her father's steward, a man named Roswell, standing too calm in the courtyard, while flames ate through the east wing where her parents slept. She told her about waking choking on smoke, about Roswell's hand closing over her mouth, not to save her, but to silence her, about the moment she'd understood with the clarity of pure terror that the man who'd served her father for 15 years intended for her to die in that fire, along with the rest of her family, because a dead Hawthorne heir meant Hawthorne lands, and Hawthorne gold passed cleanly to whoever Roswell had already sold his loyalty to. I got out through the servants' passage, Cora said. I don't fully remember how. I remember running. I remember deciding, somewhere in those woods, that Cora Hawthorne had died in that fire, because if she was dead, no one would come looking for her. And if no one came looking for her, she might actually survive long enough to grow up. She looked down at her bandaged hand. I've been Cora ever since. Just Cora. No house, no name, no inheritance. I built a life small enough that nobody would ever think to ask questions about where it came from. Wynne was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable in a way that frightened Cora more than anger would have. 11 years, Wynne said finally. You've carried that alone for 11 years. It was safer alone. It was lonelier alone, Wynne corrected, not unkindly. There's a difference, though I understand why a 15-year-old girl running from a man who wanted her dead might not have known it at the time. She reached across the table and took Cora's good hand in both of hers, the same gesture of fierce gratitude she'd offered at the crossroads. Do you know what happened to Hawthorne lands after the fire? I assumed they were absorbed into the Crown's territories, eventually. Most unclaimed estates are. They were granted, Wynne said carefully, to a man named Garrick Voss, 8 years ago, on the recommendation of a steward who claimed to have served the Hawthorne family loyally and witnessed the death of the entire bloodline with his own eyes. She watched Cora's face carefully as the name landed. Garrick Voss currently sits on my son's council. He has sat there for 6 years. He has, in fact, been advocating quite strongly in recent council sessions for increased authority over the Western Territories. Territories that include what used to be Hawthorne lands, and several others besides. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Cora's chair. Roswell, she said. Is he? Still alive, as far as I know. Serving as Voss's household steward, in fact, which I find difficult to believe is coincidence. Wynne's grip on her hand tightened. Cora, I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it clearly. You did not stumble into my carriage by accident 5 days ago. The crossroads where we broke down sits on the old road between the capital and the Western Territories. Voss's territories. My guards' hesitation to act, their strange paralysis about whose authority it was to save me. I did not think much of it at the time, beyond fury. I am thinking considerably more of it now. You think it wasn't an accident, the carriage. I think, Wynne said slowly, that I should have died in that ditch, and that several people would have found that outcome very convenient, and that the only reason I am sitting here instead of in a cold vault beneath the chapel is because a girl with every reason to keep her head down and her name buried chose instead to break a window with her bare hands. Cora felt something cold settle into her chest alongside the old grief. Not fear, exactly, though fear was there too. Something sharper. Something that had been waiting 11 years for permission to wake up. Does Evander know? She asked. About any of this? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Wynne's eyes were steady, searching. This is your story, Cora Hawthorne. Your name, your inheritance, your danger. You decide who learns it, and when, and how. But I will tell you this much as a mother who nearly drowned in a ditch 5 days ago. My son does not yet know that the woman who saved my life may have done so at the cost of waking a threat that's been sleeping in his own council chamber for 6 years. I think he deserves to know. I think, more than that, you deserve allies in this, and you will not find better ones than the crown. Cora sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the shape of a decision that would either keep her safely buried for the rest of her quiet, careful life, or crack it open entirely. If I tell him, she said slowly, and Voss learns I'm alive, Voss will learn regardless, the moment we move against him. The only question is whether you face that moment with the full weight of the crown behind you, or alone, as you've faced everything else for 11 years. Wynne squeezed her hand once, firm. You don't have to decide today. But don't let old fear make the decision for you simply because it's familiar. You are not 15 anymore. You are not running through smoke with no one behind you. Whatever you choose it from strength now, not survival. Cora looked down at the bandage across her palm, the wound she'd earned tearing a king's mother out of dark water, and thought of Roswell's hand closing over her mouth in another lifetime, silencing a girl who'd had no power to stop him. She was not that girl anymore. She had broken glass with her bare hands 5 days ago, without a single moment's hesitation. Tell him, she said. I want Evander to know. Wynne's face broke into something fierce and proud. Good girl, she said softly. Now, let's go find my son before that council session he's currently suffering through gives him an excuse to avoid us both. Evander listened to the whole of it without interrupting once. That, more than anything, told Cora something about the kind of man he was. He sat across the council table from her in the late afternoon light, Wynne beside him, his hands folded and his jaw set in a stillness that reminded her of the moment at the crossroads when he'd knelt in the mud. The stillness of a man holding something enormous very carefully, so it wouldn't shatter in his grip. When she finished, the fire, Roswell's hand over her mouth, 11 years of a stolen name worn like armor. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Lo, Garrick Voss sat across from me in council yesterday and proposed that I grant him expanded jurisdiction over the western roads. I thanked him for his diligence. You didn't know, Cora said. I should have known. His voice had gone hard, though she understood now it wasn't aimed at her. A man inherits an entire bloodline's lands on the word of his own steward. No formal inquiry, no body ever recovered for the daughter, and I never once thought to question it because the paperwork was clean, and my father trusted the recommendation that placed him there. He shook his head slowly. I'm going to take considerable pleasure in unmaking that cleanliness. There's no proof, Cora said. Not yet. Just my word, and a story that's 11 years cold. Your word, Evander said, is not nothing. But you're right that we'll want more before I move against a sitting council member. Voss has allies. If we act too quickly without binding evidence, he'll simply claim you're an imposter playing on royal sympathy, and half the council will believe him, because it's easier than believing one of their own arranged a child's murder for land. It was Wynne who spoke next, her tone careful. Roswell is still in Voss's household. If he could be questioned, he'd warn Voss the moment any one official came near him, Evander said. We need someone he wouldn't recognize as a threat, someone who could get close without raising alarm. His eyes moved to Cora, and she watched the thought arrive in his face a half-second before he said it aloud, watched him visibly hate the idea even as he reached it. Someone he believes is dead. No, Wynne said immediately, sharp. Absolutely not. I won't have her walking into that household alone. I didn't say alone, Evander said, though something tight had entered his voice. I said the idea exists, I haven't decided I'll allow it. You don't get to allow anything regarding my choices, Cora said, and watched both of their heads turn toward her. I appreciate the protectiveness. I do, but I spent 11 years making myself small, so that man would never find a reason to look for me twice. I am done being something that has to be protected from my own life. Evander's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue. He had the look of a man entirely unused to being told no by anyone in that room. But then something in his expression eased, reluctant respect bleeding through the worry. What would you propose then? He said, since apparently I'm not permitted to propose anything for you. Voss doesn't know my face, not as an adult. The last time anyone in that household saw Cora Hawthorne, I was 15 and half my face was still rounded with childhood. She thought it through as she spoke, the shape of a plan assembling itself with the same clean instinct that had moved her hands toward that carriage lantern 5 days ago. But the Hawthorne lands border the territory the king controls directly. If a royal delegation arrived to review border holdings, a routine administrative visit, nothing alarming. A member of that delegation's household staff would have every reason to be in Voss's manor without suspicion. You want to go in as a servant, Evander said slowly. I want to go in as someone no one looks at twice, which is, conveniently, a skill I've had 11 years to perfect. Wynne made a small sound that might have been a laugh if the situation had allowed for laughing. She has a point, Evander. She has a point that terrifies me, Evander said, but the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by something heavier. The particular exhaustion of a man realizing he could not protect someone simply by wanting to. If anything in that house recognizes you, then I run, Cora said. I've done it before. I'm good at it. That isn't a comfort. It wasn't meant to be a comfort. It was meant to be true. He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, frustration, and underneath it, unmistakably, a kind of fear that had nothing to do with politics or evidence. I don't want you anywhere near that man, he said, quieter now, the council room formality dropping away entirely. I want that plainly understood before we go further. Not because I think you're incapable, because the thought of you standing in a room with the man who tried to burn you alive makes something in my chest want to set the world on fire instead. The room seemed to narrow around just the two of them, Wynne politely studying the maps on the wall as though she hadn't heard every word. I know, Cora said, softer now too. But I don't think either of us gets to choose the parts of this that don't frighten us. I didn't choose to be born into a family someone wanted dead. You didn't choose to inherit a council seat occupied by the man who arranged it. We just get to choose what we do next. Evander exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders dropped half an inch. The particular surrender of a man who knew he'd already lost an argument he hadn't fully wanted to win. If you do this, he said, you do it with guards I trust positioned close enough to reach you within minutes. Not visible, not obvious, but close. I can agree to that. And the moment anything feels wrong, you find a reason to leave. I don't care if it costs us the evidence. I will find another way to bury Voss. I will not find another version of you. Something in Cora's chest cracked open at that, warm and frightening in equal measure, the same warmth she'd felt at the reflecting pool 2 nights before, except larger now, harder to pretend she hadn't noticed. All right, she said. The delegation was assembled within 3 days, a small, unremarkable party led by a minor border official. Cora installed among the household staff with a forged service history Wynne's own people produced with unsettling speed. They rode out toward Voss's territory beneath a sky the color of old iron, and Cora spent the journey rehearsing a version of herself flat enough to be invisible. A servant girl with no particular history and no particular face, burying Cora Hawthorne back beneath careful stillness one more time. Though this time, she reminded herself, it was a choice rather than a sentence. Voss's manor sat where Hawthorne Hall had once stood, rebuilt over the ashes in cold gray stone that bore no resemblance to the warm timber house of her childhood. Walking through its front gates for the first time in 11 years, Cora felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, grief and fury arriving together like old friends she'd hoped never to see again. Roswell was older than she remembered, grayer, heavier through the middle, but his voice when he gave orders to the kitchen staff was exactly as she remembered it. The same flat, unbothered authority of a man who had never once lost a night's sleep over what he'd done. She kept her eyes down. She kept her hands busy. She waited. And on the second night, carrying a tray of wine up the back stairs toward the study where Voss conducted what the household staff called, in lowered voices, his private business. She heard her father's name spoken through a half-open door in a tone that made the careful stillness she'd built crack right down the center. The Hawthorne fire was clean work, Voss was saying to someone Cora couldn't see. Roswell handled it well all those years ago. The only loose thread was always the daughter, and Roswell swore on his life she burned with the rest of them. I trust that's still true. As far as anyone living knows, came Roswell's voice, low and satisfied. Cora Hawthorne has been dead for 11 years. There's no one left to say otherwise. Cora stood frozen on the stairs, the tray trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands, and thought, not for much longer. The tray didn't fall. That was the only mercy Cora allowed herself in that frozen moment on the stairs, steadying her hands around the wine, forcing her breath back into something even, while her father's name still hung in the air on the other side of that door like smoke that hadn't finished rising. She climbed the rest of the stairs as though she'd heard nothing at all. She delivered the wine. She kept her eyes down while Voss thanked her absently, and Roswell didn't so much as glance at her twice. And when she finally reached the servants' passage on the far side of the house, she pressed her back to the cold stone wall and allowed herself exactly one shaking breath before walking, steady and unhurried, toward the kitchen courtyard where a stable boy, one of Evander's men in plain clothes she'd been told, though she hadn't known which one until he caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, stood waiting with the horses. I need to leave tonight, she said quietly. Now, if it can be arranged without drawing attention. It could be, and it was. By the time the moon had climbed fully over Voss's gray towers, Cora was 3 miles down the western road, riding hard beside 2 guards who'd kept their distance from the manor all week without ever once being more than a quarter hour from her, and her heart was still pounding from confirmation she'd both expected and, in some small foolish corner of herself, prayed she wouldn't find. Evander met her in the castle courtyard himself, not waiting for her to be brought to him, his face carved from something between fury and relief in the torchlight. You heard them, he said. It wasn't a question. Voss ordered it. Roswell carried it out. They said it plainly, like men discussing a hunt that went well. She dismounted before he could reach to help her, needing the solid ground beneath her own feet before she let herself feel anything else. It's not just my word against his anymore. There were 2 of them in that room. If I can find even one servant willing to swear they overheard the same conversation. You don't need to find anyone else, Evander said. I have my own people inside that household. They've been listening since the day you walked through those gates, exactly as I promised. His hand came up, not quite touching her, hovering at her jaw as though he needed to confirm with his own eyes that she was whole. It's done, Cora. We have enough. More than enough. The council convened 3 days later, in the largest chamber the castle held, doors thrown open to allow nobles and witnesses alike, because Evander had made it plain from the outset that this would not be settled quietly. No more quiet rooms where men decide whose problem a drowning woman is, he'd said to Wynne the night before, low and certain. This happens where everyone can see it. Garrick Voss stood at the center of that chamber in his fine gray coat, composure cracking by degrees as the evidence was laid out before him. The testimony of 2 household staff who'd overheard his own words through that study door, The financial records Wynn's stewards had quietly assembled over 3 days, showing payments made to Roswell in the months immediately following the Hawthorne fire. And finally, devastatingly, Roswell himself, brought forward in chains, his bravado collapsing the moment he understood the depth of what had already been proven against him. "She's dead," Voss said, his composure finally breaking as he turned to scan the gathered nobles, searching for an ally and finding none. "The Hawthorne girl died in that fire 11 years ago. There is no possible—" "I didn't die," Cora said. She stepped forward from where she'd stood at the edge of the chamber, and the entire room seemed to draw breath at once. She had dressed for this moment with Wynn's careful help, not the servant's plain wool she'd worn into Voss's manor, not the tavern apron from the crossroads, but something simpler and more honest than either. Deep gray, unadorned, the kind of dress a woman might wear who had nothing left to prove and no one left to perform for. Voss's face went the color of old ash. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier force. "You're a serving girl, a tavern girl from—" "I was 15 years old," Cora said, and her voice did not shake, though something in her chest was shaking violently enough for both. "I woke up choking on smoke in my own home while a man I had trusted my entire life held his hand over my mouth so I couldn't scream for help. I escaped through the servants' passage because I knew it better than he did, because I'd spent my whole childhood running through that house, and he'd only spent his pretending to serve it." She turned finally to look directly at Roswell, who would not meet her eyes. "I have spent 11 years as no one, with no name, because the alternative was a man who'd already decided I should be dead, finishing what he started. I am done being no one." The chamber had gone utterly silent. Somewhere near the front, Wynn sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes bright, watching with an expression that held no surprise at all, only fierce, unconcealed pride. "Cora Hawthorne," Evander said, rising from his seat at the head of the chamber, his voice carrying with the particular authority that required no volume to fill a room. "Daughter of Lord Aldrich and Lady Marin Hawthorne, stands before this council having survived an attempt on her life arranged by Garrick Voss and carried out by his steward Roswell for the purpose of seizing land and title that were never legally Voss's to claim. The evidence presented today is not circumstantial, it is overwhelming." His eyes moved over the assembled nobles, daring contradiction, finding none. "Garrick Voss is stripped of all titles, lands, and council position, effective immediately. He and his steward will stand trial for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder of a noble heir. The Hawthorne lands and title are restored, in full, to their rightful heir." Voss made a sound that wasn't quite words, something between protest and disbelief, but the guards were already moving, and the chamber's attention had already shifted past him entirely, toward Cora, toward the strange, impossible fact of a dead girl standing very much alive in the center of a council chamber that had just rewritten 11 years of history in the space of a single hearing. It took weeks after that for the shape of her new life to settle into something she recognized. There were papers to sign, lands to inspect, a half-burned manor house that would need rebuilding, or perhaps— As Cora found herself deciding one quiet afternoon walking its grounds, simply leveling entirely so something new could rise in its place. Not a monument to what had been taken from her, but something chosen, something hers. Roswell confessed everything once the weight of evidence made denial pointless, naming names, dates, the precise sum Voss had paid him to ensure no Hawthorne heir survived the fire to inherit. Voss, for his part, never confessed to anything, going to his trial with the same cold composure he'd worn in council, though it did him no good against testimony, records, and a girl very much alive who stared at him across the courtroom without flinching once. Cora found, in the aftermath, that she had expected the verdict to feel like triumph, and instead, it felt mostly like exhaustion. A long-held breath finally released, leaving behind not euphoria, but a kind of quiet, bone-deep relief. The fury she'd carried for 11 years didn't vanish overnight, but it began, slowly, to loosen its grip on her chest, making room for something else to grow in the space it had occupied. She found Evander in the same garden, by the same reflecting pool, on an evening some 3 weeks after the trial's end. The air gone soft and warm with early summer. "I keep waiting for it to feel finished," she admitted, coming to stand beside him without needing to be invited this time. "The lands are mine again. The men who tried to erase me are in chains or worse. And I keep waiting to feel like the girl who ran through that smoke finally gets to rest." "Grief doesn't finish on a schedule," Evander said quietly. "Even justice doesn't undo what happened. It only makes room for what comes after." "And what comes after?" He turned to face her fully then, something steady and certain in his expression that she'd come to recognize over the past weeks as entirely unlike the careful authority he wore in council chambers, something that belonged only to her, offered without performance. "That depends," he said, "on what you want it to be. You could rebuild Hawthorne Hall and live there as its lady, independent, answerable to no one, which I think you have more than earned the right to choose." His hand found hers, careful around the faint scar still visible across her palm. "Or you could choose something else. Someone else. I'm not going to pretend I haven't hoped, every day since that crossroads, that you might choose the second thing. But I need you to know the first option is real. I will not have you choose me because you feel some debt for my mother's life, or because the world has finally handed you safety, and you're afraid to ask for more than that. I'm not choosing you out of debt," Cora said. "I've had 11 years of choosing survival because it was the only thing available to me. This is the first time in all those years I've gotten to choose something simply because I wanted it." Her fingers tightened around his. "I want this. I want you. Not the crown. Not the safety. Though I won't pretend those things don't matter. I want the man who knelt in mud for his mother and meant it. I want the man who let me walk into danger because he respected me too much to cage me from it, even when it terrified him." Something in Evander's face broke open then, unguarded in a way she'd only glimpsed once before, at the crossroads, when he'd thought his mother might be dying. "Cora Hawthorne," he said, low. "I have ruled this kingdom since I was 23 years old, and I have never once in all that time wanted anything as simply or as completely as I want a future with you in it." She laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her, the first one in longer than she could remember, that didn't carry some old grief folded inside it. "That's a very formal way of saying it. I'm a very formal man, generally." The corner of his mouth lifted, that rare, almost smile she'd come to treasure more than she'd admit to anyone. "Would you prefer something less formal?" "I'd prefer the truth, in whatever shape it comes." "The truth," he said, "is that the day you broke that window with your bare hands, something in me recognized you before I understood why. I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of standing beside someone who chooses what's right, before she's finished being afraid of it." The wedding, when it came that autumn, was modest by the standards of crowns and kingdoms. Wynne had insisted, gently but immovably, that Cora deserved a day that felt like her own, rather than a spectacle built for nobles she barely knew. They held it in the rebuilt gardens of Hawthorne Hall, half-finished still, scaffolding visible against one wing, because Cora had refused to wait for perfection before claiming her own joy. Wynne stood close throughout, beaming in a way that made it clear she considered the whole arrangement at least partly her own doing, which, Cora reflected, it largely was. Roswell and Voss remained where justice had placed them, names spoken now only in old council records, and the occasional cautionary tale told to ambitious men who might otherwise consider betrayal a safe wager. Cora visited the rebuilt Hawthorne lands twice a season, walking grounds that had finally stopped feeling like a grave and started, slowly, feeling like a beginning instead. She kept the tavern apron, in the end. folded carefully in a chest in her new chambers. A strange small relic of the woman who'd broken a window with her bare hands, rather than wait for someone braver to act first. She didn't need it anymore. But she liked remembering that the bravest thing she'd ever done had happened before anyone knew her name at all, before crowns or titles or justice had given her permission to matter. It had simply been her, in the rain, deciding that someone needed saving, and that she would be the one to do it. Everything after that, the throne beside Evander, the lands restored, the long overdue justice finally served, had only been the world catching up to a truth she'd known in her bones since the moment she tore that lantern free, that she had never needed permission to be someone worth listening to. She had only needed, finally, the chance to prove it where everyone could see.